This is Mike Woody. I'm a partner at the East End Group. It's a small firm in Washington that we do quite a bit of work in the FDA space. I want to talk to you first about exactly how this presentation is going to go. What we'd like to do is explain what the FDA does, probably in some more specific terms than what most people kind of think about generally when they think about the FDA. Then we're going to talk about the linkage between the Food and Drug Administration and how the industry actually operates. In other words, how the industry moves products from the clinical pre-discovery phase through the clinical trial phase and into the FDA review phase, and then eventually how products are marketed. But the impact of the FDA review process on that for both the industry's ability to innovate as well as the access to new medicines for patients. And then we're going to talk about the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which is, among other things, one of the pieces of legislation that provides funding for the Food and Drug Administration, particularly in the human drug review areas of the agency. So if we can go to the first slide, please. So I think most people have some kind of a picture in their head of what the FDA does. And probably a useful way to think of it is, what did you do when you got up this morning before you got on this webinar? Most people brushed their teeth. Most people took some sort of a prescription medication. Some of you may have used medical devices that were regulated by the agency. And if any of you all are tobacco users and you had a cigarette this morning, that's also regulated by the agency, newly as of 2009. The agency has a very, very broad mandate. In fact, the agency regulates about 25% of the U.S. economy, which is probably a much, much broader impact than most people realize. Next slide, please. Here's this is a common slide that we use to sort of show the breadth of the agency in another way. This is how the centers within the FDA are divided. And you can see actually a lot of different things that you were expecting and maybe some things that you weren't. So for example, we'll be talking about a lot today, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They are in charge of regulating prescription medications, over-the-counter drugs, and therapeutic biologics. You can see all the way down some things that you may be surprised about. Feed, animal drugs, and animal devices, also regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Foods other than meat and poultry, also regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And as I said, newly, tobacco products. And the real point here, again, is to show the breadth of what the agency does. Here. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical trouble advancing the slides. 1 second. So this next slide shows you the impact of the agency on the U.S. economy. And the important point about this is that the FDA, because of its breadth, has a great impact on how the industries that it regulates operate. And from the pharmaceutical industry perspective and the jobs that it supports in places like Maryland, what you see, what you need to see is an FDA that actually works very well and is very efficient, because without that, you end up having a negative impact on the industries that are regulated. So for the pharmaceutical industry, it's important to note that without the FDA's approval, products cannot be marketed. It's the same way for medical devices. So the efficiency of the agency, the staffing of the agency, the way that the agency operates has a direct impact on the industry's ability to bring products to market and a direct impact on the ability of patients to be able to have access to new medications. This is a chart that shows you a little bit more about the employment within the biopharmaceutical sector. There are a little under 700,000 jobs in the pharmaceutical sector across the country. That's direct employment. And those jobs are concentrated primarily in the mid-Atlantic states, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, on up into New York, also Connecticut. We have a lot of jobs in North Carolina, Texas, Illinois, and a lot in California. And there are other states as well. Every single state in the union actually has some direct jobs from the sector. And all of those jobs are affected by how the Food and Drug Administration works. Now there's also, and this is important too, another part of the employment picture, and that's indirect employment. And indirect employment could be defined as jobs that are in part supported by the direct jobs that the sector supports. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Pharmaceutical products have to be shipped. They are made in factories that have to be of sufficient quality to produce consistent batches of pharmaceutical grade product. And a lot of those jobs are incredibly important to how the local economies in your areas operate. And so that's an important point that we want to make sure everybody understands. Now we get back to the FDA and how they're budgeted. And this is actually a pretty important point. One of the things that you'll see is that the FDA budget is relatively small considering the breadth of its regulatory mandate. The FDA every year gets a little under $2.5 billion in appropriated resources from Congress. That is actually pretty small considering what FDA is asked to do. And what we did was we put together a slide here that shows a comparison between the FDA and the CDC. The FDA is a regulatory agency. The CDC is not, actually. It's a public health agency. Everybody probably has some idea of some of the things that the CDC does, but they basically track diseases in the U.S. and around the world. They are responsible for the Strategic National Stockpile, amongst other things, and they have a very, very big budget compared to the FDA. And there's a couple of reasons historically, I think, for this. One of those is that the Food and Drug Administration is funded out of the Agriculture Appropriations Bill that Congress passes every year. If you are a member of the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee in Congress, you are very likely from an ag state and care a little bit more about ag policy than you probably do about drugs and medical devices. That's not always true, but historically it has been true. And so the FDA over time has gotten a little bit less attention than other agencies that fall into that appropriations bill. So historically what you've seen is a relatively small budget for the agency given the agency's mandate. There is another pot of funding that the FDA receives, and that is through industry user fees. And the agency receives about $1.5 billion in user fees from different regulated industries every single year. So that would be the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry, newly coming up this year, the generic drug industry. And those user fees supplement the FDA's relatively small budget. But still, even with those user fees, you'll see that the actual size of the agency budget is still relatively small, around $4 billion. Next slide, please. This is a slide that we generally show to talk about how the process of discovering a prescription medication works. And there's several things that you'd want to note along the way. One is the length of time that it actually takes. And generally the rule of thumb is it takes about 10 years to develop a new product. The other is the cost associated with doing that. And for a small molecule drug, that cost is around $1 billion. For biologic products, which are more complicated drugs that are made from proteins, those products cost usually in excess of $1 billion to produce, partially because it takes more difficult to construct manufacturing facilities to produce those products. But if you look at this slide, you will note the timeline involved, and you'll note a couple of places where the FDA is involved. And the first is when an investigational new drug is submitted to the agency. And that happens after a company has narrowed down a number of molecules that they want to study in a particular disease. And usually what will happen is they will narrow that down over time in the lab, also using computer models as of late, and they will figure out which drugs, which molecules they think that are in their library will be most effective in a particular disease state. At that point in time, they will decide if they want to bring that molecule to the clinical trial phase, and they will sit down and have a meeting with the FDA and submit an investigational new drug application. And the FDA will then give them clearance to go ahead and start testing that molecule in humans. And this is the stage at which a lot of the cost associated with the clinical trial process occurs. It is extremely expensive to recruit for clinical trials, and depending on what type of disease that you are looking at, it can be very difficult to recruit patients for clinical trials. And the clinical trial phase, you are basically trying to get safety and efficacy data together that you can later submit to the agency to support your new drug application. And this is probably the most important part of it, where the FDA comes into play. You'll see at the right-hand side of this slide the two blocks at the end where the Food and Drug Administration review process comes into play after your NDA is submitted. Next slide, please. And this is what that process looks like. A company will submit a new drug application that has their safety and efficacy data in it. That application will be reviewed by the agency. And the agency looks at risks and benefits of a particular molecule. And it's important to note that risk and benefit and the calculation that FDA looks at when they're evaluating risk and benefit is not static. It actually varies from product to product. And an easy way to think about this is the difference that the FDA would look at between, say, a new statin that came onto the market and a stage 3 cancer medication. So if you look at a statin, there are already a lot of statins on the market now. It's clearly not an unmet medical need. And if a company tried to market a product in that class and it had a particular risk profile that the FDA was concerned about, the FDA likely would not approve that product because the benefit to patients would not be particularly great compared to what the risks are. If you take, on the other hand, a cancer medication that's in, say, that's aimed at a stage 3 cancer, the FDA will look at that very, very differently. And what they'll say is, okay, while there is a risk associated with this, there aren't a lot of other products out there for this particular thing. And it's in the best interest of patients to actually have access to a medication in this class, and it's more likely that they will approve it. So it really is a decision that's not static. It has a lot to do with the disease state. It has a lot to do with the patient population that a particular product is aimed towards, and what other options are available on the market. However, if a product, if the FDA evaluates a product to be to have a higher benefit than its potential risk, they will go ahead and take action and approve the product. And that's when it can be sold in the U.S. It's important to note here, too, I think, the FDA has a great deal of authority in the post-market setting, and they got a lot of this authority in 2007 when when Congress reauthorized the last Prescription Drug User Fee Act. It is possible now for the FDA to compel a company to continue to study a product after it's already been marketed, particularly if they have concerns about a particular safety signal that a product may be exhibiting. So the FDA actually has quite a lot of authority in the post-marketing setting that they did not have before. And they've exercised this a lot over the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So the previous slide showed you the FDA review process. And over time, the FDA review process has not necessarily always been terribly efficient. And back in the late 80s and early 90s, it is hard to actually remember now, but HIV was a death sentence, basically. There were very, very few products that were available. And HIV groups were rightly critical of the industry as well as the FDA for being slow to put new products onto the market. And one of the problems that they identified was the length of time that it took the agency to review new drug applications once they were submitted to the FDA. And so because of that criticism, Congress began to look at how they could solve that problem. And very quickly, what people figured out was that FDA did not have a workforce that was sufficient enough to be able to review the new drug applications that were coming into the agency in any sort of timely way. And what the FDA needed was more resources, more money to hire more reviewers within the human drug review components of the agency. And so the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was born. And this is actually what it looked like. But basically, what it was a deal between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry would pay user fees as part of a new drug application, and those fees would go to support the human drug review function at the agency, particularly new reviewers and the training and some other things for those reviewers. And this was actually a really, really important breakthrough. What you actually saw after that was a decrease in the time that it took for products to be reviewed. The industry, importantly, as part of these user fees, got something in return. Because they funded money into the agency that went to pay for the reviewers, they got statutory timelines. And basically the way that it works now and has worked over the last 20 years is that there are two timelines that the industry gets. One is for a standard review, which is a standard product that would be going through the agency. And the agency should be reviewing those products within 10 months. The other is for priority review products. These are products for unmet medical needs. The agency should be reviewing these within a 6-month period of time. So the deal was actually pretty good. The pharmaceutical industry pays money into the agency hires up reviewers, and the industry also gets some efficiency out of the process. Importantly, if you look at the bottom part, if this User Fee Act is not reauthorized, it has a direct impact on the employees at the agency. The agency will have to send layoff notices, RIF notices, beginning late this summer to around 2,000 FDA employees that are supported by the user fees. And if Congress does not act, those employees will lose their jobs. And it's important to underscore that those employees are largely the human drug reviewers at the agency. And if those employees lose their jobs, human drug review basically grinds to a halt. At that point, companies cannot get products through the FDA review process in any sort of timely way, which basically halts their ability to be able to market new products, which also has a direct impact on what patients can expect out of the agency, as well as the downstream economic effect of that within the companies themselves and the communities that are around them. Next slide, please. This is a slide that shows how the Prescription Drug User Fee Act has worked over time. And this is actually a really important thing to internalize. In 1990, it took about 2.5 years to get a new drug application reviewed at the agency. And that has decreased quite a lot to today, where on average it takes around 13 months. You'll note, though, that FDA still doesn't always meet their statutory deadlines, but there's been an enormous improvement. And that is a big, big victory, not just for the industry and not just for the agency, but for people that are waiting on new medications too. It also, I would say, has an impact on the competitiveness of companies globally. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a great deal of concern that it was easier to get a product marketed in Europe faster than it was in the U.S. And the influx of money that went into the agency through the Prescription Drug User Fee Act actually made basically those two regulatory bodies more or less equitable in how they reviewed products, at least in the drug space. So from our perspective, this has actually been a very, very big success. Next slide, please. This is actually shows you the review times for new drugs under all of the PDUFA reauthorizations, and the trend lines for all of them have been largely down. You'll see a couple of spikes here and there, and one of the things that's attributed to is that the number of new drug applications that go into the agency every year isn't necessarily constant. The workload that the agency has can increase depending on the success of the industry at developing new products. So you see that too. But either way, what you're really looking at is a downward trend that has done a lot to bring new products onto the market for the benefit of patients. Next slide, please. So the Prescription Drug User Fee Act is up for reauthorization this year in front of Congress. It is probably the most important healthcare piece of legislation that Congress will do this year. And it's not unencumbered by potential problems. It's very difficult, as you know, to get just about anything through Congress these days. It is a presidential election year, and politics does seem to infiltrate just about everything. It's going to be difficult to move anything off the Senate floor because members will have all kinds of other ancillary issues that they may want to address. There are also other user fee agreements that move at the same time as the Prescription Drug User Fee Act as part of the same legislative package. I mentioned the Medical Device User Fee Act. Also, there's a Generic Drug User Fee Act and a Biologics User Fee Act. They all move together. And the politics of those user fee acts also play into how this bill moves through Congress. One of the things that we often are asked is who is against moving something like this that actually funds the agency in what appears to be a pretty good benefit. And the real answer is no one in the abstract. But that's typically not the way that Congress moves things at all, as I mentioned before. It really has to do with all the other things that Congress may want to add to it. This is the only time really that Congress looks at FDA-related legislation within a 5-year period of time. Because the user fee acts come up every 5 years, Congress typically doesn't look at the FDA until now. So because of that, what they do is they will look at the FDA and the agency top to bottom and will decide, are there some things that I would like to change at the agency? And so all kinds of things pop up, and this year is no different. Congress is looking at a number of different areas to add some legislative riders to this package as it goes through. One is in the drug shortages space. One is in the supply chain integrity space. A lot of you all may remember the heparin scare that happened in 2007 that dealt with the deliberately counterfeited active pharmaceutical ingredient in the blood thinner heparin that made its way to the U.S. Congress, after that, has spent a lot of time looking at the global supply chain and is going to be adding some authorities at the agency to manage the global supply chain better. There are also a lot of new members of Congress that have never ever voted on this in the past. There are 144 members of the House and 22 members of the Senate that are not familiar at all, frankly, with this legislation. And so we are spending a great deal of time educating those members. As you may recall, in 2010, there were a lot of brand new members of Congress, particularly Republicans, who came to Congress with probably a more adversarial bent towards regulatory agencies. And one of the things that we have to talk a lot about is why the FDA is not the EPA in our estimation. It's extremely important for the industry and for the patients that the industry serves, as I noted, to have a smooth functioning FDA, and actually an FDA that's well funded and is working effectively. So from our perspective, we have a very, very different viewpoint about our regulator than those in other sectors. And that's a message that we've been delivering to those members. But the educational lift has been large. And as I mentioned before, this is the only chance really for FDA legislation in any kind of time frame moving forward in the future. Congress typically doesn't look at this stuff but every 5 years when the user fee agreements come up. So they all, as I said, they have all kinds of ideas. In either case, they have to reauthorize the Prescription Drug User Fee Act by September 30th of 2012. If they don't, then those FDA employees are let go, and you end up having a lot of problems getting new products reviewed, and patients have a lot of problems getting access to newer treatments. And I think what we'll do is go ahead and stop there and take any questions that you might have. There's a lot more about the political process that you might be interested in, actually, and clearly we'll take any questions on the substance of the presentation as well.